Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us here for our white bass bank fishing webinar. Apologize for the delay. We're waiting for our room to open up so we can get this thing started. So today we are going to be talking about white bass fishing here in Oklahoma, primarily fishing from the bank. So we're at that time of year now where our fish are starting to move into our rivers and our tributary systems, looking as they do their upward spawning migration. And that's really when anglers across the state can find really significant numbers of fish in short amount of time spending on the water. So we're going to address what you're what you're looking for at this time of year, where you might look to go, good public access, what lures and baits are going to work best in certain situations, depending on where you're fishing, what you should set your expectations as when you go out at this time of year. As we get into the spring, we really get the opportunity to catch fish in significant numbers. And so, kind of determining where we're at within the run, where you're fishing at, and what water temps and the amount of fish that are in there, and how to kind of identify that to see, if maybe you're just not using the right lure, you're not in the right spot, or maybe those fish just aren't ready, or they aren't there, especially if you're fishing upriver from our major reservoir system. So we'll go through all that. These asking anglers are meant to be conversational. So as we go along, as I go through different topics, please utilize the chat bar to ask questions along the way, and we'll answer those as we go. So you don't have to wait through the entire thing, and you might forget to put it in there. So we'll just answer them as we go. And if you have to jump off at any point, these are all recorded, and they'll be on our Outdoor Oklahoma Ask an Angler channel. So if you want to come back and watch them. So with that, we'll go ahead and get kicked off here, and we'll just kind of start off by discussing what white bass are. White bass are a small temperate bass species, so they are in the same family as the striped bass, and they're hybrid offspring between striped bass and white bass, which are, we call them hybrid striped bass here in Oklahoma. As you go a little bit farther into the east and southeast, you may hear them referred to as wipers. But they're essentially a genetic hybrid that attain greater weights than white bass. They don't get to quite the same size as striped bass, and they are voracious predators that live in open water. And we stock them in lakes that have abundant shad populations, and they're a good resource for anglers to be able to catch. And they also make the run with white bass. So anytime that there's a white bass run going on, depending on what body of water it is, there could be striped bass and hybrid striped bass mixed in with those schools of white bass as they make their upriver runs. But your typical white bass in Oklahoma is going to range somewhere between a quarter of a pound all the way up to about 4 pounds. They can get a little bit bigger, but the majority of your big kind of trophy class white bass are going to be somewhere in that 3 to 4 pound range. You won't catch nearly as many of those fish. You will catch a lot more fish that are in the quarter pound up to about 2 pounds, which are going to be fish that range somewhere between about 6 inches up to about 14 inches. As they get over 14 inches, white bass are shaped a lot like largemouth bass, where as they get bigger, instead of getting longer like striped bass do and carrying their weight throughout their length, they will start to get more of a circular shape like our sunfish species, largemouth bass, crappie. You're going to see fish that are kind of taking on that shape. So what we basically see with our white bass throughout the course of the year is they were a statewide fish prior to human involvement with the environment. We just didn't see them in as great numbers because Oklahoma does not have any natural water bodies that are not rivers or creeks. You might find an oxbow or a playa, something like that, but we don't have any natural lakes. So all of our native fish species were born, raised, accustomed, biologically ingrained to live within these river systems. And in Oklahoma, we have a few different types of river systems. Most of our major river systems that come through the state are what are considered prairie streams. They flow from kind of the high plains areas out of New Mexico and Colorado and through Kansas, and they come down, and as they get into more of a gradual decline in elevation, they are very sandy rivers. They'll have some rocky outcroppings, things like that. They typically run a little bit stained as they take in the mud from the clay banks and that sandy bottom. So when water is rushing through our prairie streams, they typically have some type of a cinnamon or a red color to them. Whereas if you get on the far eastern half of the state, you start running into the Ozark type streams, which are going to be clear water streams. A lot of them are spring fed as opposed to runoff from the mountains like our prairie streams are. And they have cobble bottoms, less substrate that gets milky or that off stain color. But white bass existed in all of them. And as we built reservoirs, essentially what's happened is a lot of these riverine species, like a white bass that are prolific spawners, when they had reservoirs built on their river systems, they were able to adapt to that lake life by moving down into that still water. They do not compete that much with the species that are kind of in their size range, the black bass, the crappie, the sunfish. They will live out in open water schools and chase shad, which is great for the resource because you can have this big mixture of these different species of fish that can live in our big reservoirs without really hurting each other's prey source. And shad are the same way. Shad lived in these streams, and as they came back into the lakes, they were able to get much more prolific in numbers. More of them survive. You live in a river system, you're in very confined boundaries. White bass growing up to only about 4 pounds are very susceptible to predation from other fish and from avian predators, as well as angling. So as we built big reservoirs, they're in open water fish, their numbers were able to just absolutely explode. And on average in Oklahoma, we harvest between 1 and 2 million pounds of white bass annually. So they're a great fish to catch in bulk. And being a temperate bass species, they are adapted to a little bit colder water climates as far as when they start to get active. So we typically see white bass action for what we consider the late winter, early spring fishing to be at its best. They're going to be more active in water temperatures that are below 60 degrees. They utilize water temps in between 50 and 60 degrees for their spawning runs, and they just need measurable rainfall because they prefer upstream migration as opposed to crappie and black bass and sunfish and catfish that will spawn within the lake impoundment reservoir that they are in. They will not travel upstream to go complete their spawning cycle like white bass and striped bass will. So what we start to look for at this time of year, and we've had an incredibly mild winter. We've had 2 winter storms that have come through this year. We may have a mild winter storm that will come through towards the end of next week. But overall, temperatures have been fairly warm pretty much since we've left November. We've had minimal rainfall throughout that. So typically when you get rainfall in those winter months, it's coming down either as winter precipitation or cold rain, which is going to lower water temperatures while rising the level. And we're looking for a happy balance of that. We kind of want some warmer water that comes down to raise up those water levels. And that's really what's going to trigger these fish to go. But every year, this year, we will see white bass a little bit earlier in certain parts of the state just because of where water temperatures are at. I would expect with the rain that we saw yesterday throughout the state, the southeastern part of the state always has fishing for every species kickoff before the rest of the state, as it is a warmer climate for most of the year. So those water temps get to where they need to be a couple weeks, sometimes a month faster than they will throughout the rest of the state. And essentially what you see in Oklahoma is the fishing really starts to pick up in the southeastern part of the state. And then it kind of wipes across in a diagonal band northwest as fishing picks up. So fishing is at its best in the southeast, the earliest part of the year, and then it continues to climb across the central part of the state, getting up to I-40, and then swooping across up towards the northwestern part of the state. So white bass are a perfect example of that because water temperatures are typically at this time of year very staggered in that line. So up in the northwest, we will still see water temperatures at this time of year in the high 30s, low 40s, into the mid 40s this year as we've been a little bit warmer. But in the southeastern part of the state, we're going to have water temperatures at this time of year that are already climbing into the mid 50s, if not into the high 50s. So then at that point, those white bass are ready to go and they're just looking for measurable rainfall. So I would expect fishing this weekend into the early part of next week in the southeastern part of the state to start to see its the beginning of a pretty steady white bass bite in the creeks and tributaries. These fish almost everywhere in the state will start to congregate at the mouths of the major inflows on the reservoir, no matter what part of the state, typically by the middle to the end of February. And then from there, depending on how much water is in those inflowing rivers. So major river systems like Eufaula, Grand, Broken Bow, Caw, Keystone, big stretches of large river that flow in as the major inflow. You will see fish far up the river because they're looking for offset creek tributaries to spawn off of. And so you will see stages of schooling fish that will move from the north ends of those lakes or the western ends of those lakes, and they'll follow those tributaries. And they'll, as flows rise, they'll find different areas of staging areas, whether that be the mouths of connecting tributary creeks, could be long runs along big bluff walls that create nice steady current that come off of riffles. And that's where those fish are going to look to stage until they actually have everything that they need to go to spawn, which is going to be water temperatures between 55 and 60 degrees and measurable rainfall. They will spawn. They're broadcast spawners. So they spawn at random over sticks, debris, shoals. They don't make beds. So what they're doing is they're essentially, in their brain, biologically, they have kind of a spawning route that they're going to take each year. It could be like with salmon, they go back to the place where they were born. And so for some fish, that can be an incredibly lengthy travel that takes them a month, 2 months, 3 months to complete their cycle as they go up. Other fish are going to look for the first available decent spawning habitat, and they're going to be done right when the conditions are ideal. So what we really look for is the spring forward. So what we'll get in a couple of weekends when we move that daylight saving time, our light cycle then increases by an hour, which allows for 1 extra hour a day of that light cycle really warming up temperatures in both the main bodies of water as well as these inflowing rivers and creeks and tributaries that come in that feed these white bass runs. So typically in Oklahoma, your white bass fishing is at its best from about the second or third week of March through the middle of April. So depending on where you're at in the state with water temperatures and rainfall, your peak window of the white bass run for your body of water is going to occur more often than not within that 4 to 5, 6 week window, just depending on temperatures and rainfall. Right now, east of I-35, from the Kansas border to the Texas border, we're pretty close on water temperatures. We've had this mild winter. Fish are staging in the rivers. We are getting very close to having peak runs kick off here in the next couple of weeks, which would be a shade early as opposed to the previous few years that we've had. But historically, that's right on key. A lot of longtime white bass anglers claim that when the red bud trees start blooming, that's when the white bass run is on. And that's typically because the red bud bloom links up with the change in daylight hours, outside temperatures, rainfall, all of that kind of are perfectly coincided with what white bass are also looking for when they go to make their run. So right now, this weekend, pretty much anywhere east of I-35, I would expect to see the first real steady bite of white bass from the mouths of the major bodies of water all the way up through staging areas within the rivers or creeks that are coming down and feeding it. The fish have been in there where I've been fishing. There's been fish that are stacked up. There's a lot of forage at this time of year in the rivers. You're going to have a lot of shad that are piled up in the river systems. So these white bass have a lot of natural forage. And white bass being a big schooling fish, they spend the majority of their time bottom third of the water column, especially as they're pushing up river. They're going to be kind of hunkered down, bottom of the water column, moving up. We see them come up for top water feeding Typically, as they finish up their spawn, they move back to the lake. Water temperatures are on the rise. They can push bait balls up to the surface. That's typically when we see our strong top water action starts towards the end of April, early May, and then we'll run all the way into the summer and into the fall for when you can get schools of white bass that are out in the main lake in river systems, and you can pull them up to the water surface, tailwaters, things like that. But at this time of year, they're going to be hunkered down on the bottom. They're looking to go through their spawning routine. And most of the time, these fish, even the bigger size fish, your 3 and 4 pound fish, they're only going to have mouths on them that are about that big. So really what they're looking for a bait profile, no matter you're throwing live bait, a fly, artificial lures, you're looking for something in the 1 to 3 inch range that's really going to get you bit most often. You're going to find the majority of bites, and you're going to catch big fish, because big fish can eat big baits, but they can also eat small baits, and small fish just can't get those big baits in their mouth. So typically with white bass, it's all about just the size profile more so than color or type of lure, whether it's a soft plastic or a hard bait. You're really just looking to mimic shad in a very particular size pattern that's going to be somewhere in that 1 to 2 inch range. So that's what I've been seeing locally in central Oklahoma, little east central Oklahoma, for bass that have moved up into these prairie rivers. There's a lot of them in there. We're certainly nowhere near the peak of the run yet, but there are plenty of fish to be caught. And you start to see catch rates go up. If you go out in an evening and you're finding good runs with good amounts of fish, right now, I'm averaging between about 20 and 50 fish an outing, which the expectation for white bass when the peak of the run gets going, you're really looking at catching 50 to 100 fish an hour. They just are in there so thick and feeding at those times that you're just catching fish cast after cast after cast after cast. And what that really takes is water temperatures around 55 degrees, measurable rainfall. They will hunker down on the bottom, have plenty of natural forage, and just really don't have a lot of incentive to come up off of the bottom to actively feed pre-spawn. So the females are feeding those eggs. They're making sure that they have plenty of calories, while the males are doing the same thing. They're making sure they're on this pre-spawn gorge to get as much calories as possible to be able to complete the spawning run. And for white bass, because they're a migratory fish, it requires a lot of calories to keep going. They're moving up inflowing water, as opposed to a crappie, largemouth bass spawn, where they still need to build up the calories to defend their nest, to lay the eggs, all of that, but they're in still water. So they don't have the current and everything fighting against them just to keep going. So white bass are forced to feed. And as water temperatures and that flow picks up, when they have incentive to then move from one staging area upriver to the next staging area, or if it's at the right time where they're moving from a staging area and are now on their run to just go spawn, that's when you're going to see the biggest catch rates occur. They're going to have incentive to feed, be active. There'll be enough of them in there that they're going to take whatever that they can get. And we're probably in most parts of the state, especially east of I-35, we're still a solid probably 2 weeks away from really starting to see that come in to play. But I'd imagine down in southeastern Oklahoma this weekend, Jack's Fork, Mountain Fork, the Verdigris, what else is down there? Hugo, Sardis, any of those main big white bass runs that you get down in the southeastern part of the state, I would expect to see pretty high catch rates, looking at just the amount of water that was dropped yesterday. I mean, there were places that picked up 3 inches of water. That if the water temperatures are at 50, 55 degrees, that's going to be enough to push a really big portion of those white bass from that body of water upriver to spawn, or at least to be very active within their feeding patterns. And like all species, you're going to have fish that will spawn the first chance they get. When water temps are good for egg viability and they have water flow to be able to get to where their spawning habitat is at, you're going to see them spawn early. You'll also have schools of fish that they won't spawn until the very other far end of the spectrum, when water temps are at their highest for what they can support for spawning their eggs. So typically that peak is going to occur somewhere in the middle of that. And right now, for most of the state, that's still going to be another 2 or 3 weeks away. But there are fish to be caught right now. If you're east of I-35, we have enough water in our river systems that there are going to be fish in key staging areas all the way along. So as we go through this presentation, I'm going to go over just the different baits and lures that you can use. Because the white bass run, we're catching fish in such tremendous numbers. Live bait is not as effective as artificial baits, because live bait you're paying for, or you're netting. And depending on how you're keeping it alive, you're going to be just going through way too much bait. So it's more productive and efficient to use artificial lures at this time of year for white bass, because you can go through, especially if you're using hard baits or like hair jigs, you don't have to change them unless you snap them off or get them snagged up. Soft plastics, you're going to get some wear and tear and you'll have to change them off. But a bag of soft plastics and some jig heads is still pretty cost effective compared to the amount of fish and bites that you'd be getting at this time of year for utilizing live bait. And we're fishing in current most of the time. So the white bass from here on out, most of your main fishing is going to be within the river system. It might be right at the north end of the lake if the given body of water where that inflowing those main tributaries come in. If there's public access, like right there where fish are going to move up, Grand Lake, for example, the Neosho River and the Spring River split off at Twin Bridges State Park, which cuts off both of those tributaries. That is a place that you can fish from the bank in the main body of water with still current, but not as much as when you move upstream and that water is really ripping through. So bobbers, slip floats, things like that. We're kind of past that at this point. That's really more of a February. As those fish are pushing up into the mouths or the north ends of lakes, they will start to school before they push up into the river systems, and they'll still be hunkered down lower in the water column. And that's where live bait or slip float presentations or fishing vertically from a dock or from a boat are going to be most effective. We're really in the next month and a half window of targeting fish with artificial lures in flowing water up these inflows, tailwaters, creeks, anything like that. So where you can get to public access. So we'll go over where there are places to look for as far as public access go. In Oklahoma, we were pretty limited with public access when it comes to our river systems being like on the bank to go fish. So boat ramps, things like that, tailwaters are going to have the majority of that. But there are some areas across the state that are going to be right of way areas that maybe the county owns, where they allow access to rivers, creek mouths, things like that. So we'll kind of touch on that and then go over what baits you're going to look to find the most success with. Pennington Creek, heard it's really good for springtime sand bass. Never been there. Do you know where there would be good public access? Yeah, so on Pennington Creek, there's two low waters. One is going to be just south of Tishomingo. One is right in Tishomingo, but essentially if you get on Google Map for Pennington Creek, there's a city park that runs the big bend in the creek, and there's a road that runs along that, and it dead ends at the low water. And that low water is essentially stopping all fish from Texoma from getting farther up Pennington Creek without substantial rainfall to go up over the low water. So what ends up happening is you can catch white bass on Texoma at the Tishomingo National Wildlife Refuge, right at those big pools, the backwater, right as Pennington Creek and the Washita split and start to go. There's some public access and some boat ramps right down there at the mouth. And then in Tishomingo, there's the whole city park, but really the public access at the low water. That first one, those fish are going to push up. And until there's water to push them up over it, it's a great little hole right in there where those fish are going to get stuck and be staging. But it is very dependent because it is such a small creek. You really have to hit that perfect. You have to have the perfect water temperatures and the perfect amount of water flow. And when that happens, it is phenomenal. But they do not hold. That water is so shallow that right below that low water, if there's not enough water, they will kick back down towards the lake. So that's a decent area right there at at the refuge, you can put a kayak or a small boat in, and also bank fish right there. And there's good staging areas back to the mouth of Pennington Creek. But that up in town in Tishomingo at those two low waters where it can be shooting fish in a barrel when you have water coming through is very, very dependent on water temp and rain, and they have to be at the same time. Otherwise, those fish will just drop back down because they don't have enough room to stack in there like they can in a bigger river system. But so I'm going to start with going through just the lures that we have here. With white bass, like I said, we're really all you're trying to do is mimic shad. That is their main forage. Shad, minnows, that is what the primary diet makes up. And so that opens up the tackle box quite a bit. Anytime that you're fishing any of the lures or soft plastics, anything like that, its intention is to mimic a natural prey source for the most part. They're species like largemouth bass, I mean, white bass, striped bass, really any fish is going to have some reactionary response, whether it be defense, whether it be, hunger, if they're not getting fed a lot, if they don't have a good prey source. Then you can use things that, might not be mimicking anything that is naturally right there in the water for them, but you get reactionary strikes. But primarily what we're attempting to do when we fish with artificial lures or flies is we're trying to replicate what the natural prey source is for that given species that we're targeting in that given body of water. Our prey species alter as you move across the state, depending on what river system you're in, what body of water, you're going to have different forage species. But for white bass, it's pretty simple because they are a schooling open water fish that is perfect for targeting shad. So shad are very basic forage. Gizzard shads are silver with black backs, black marks, very easy to replicate. Threadfin shad, depending on the water clarity, are going to be a silver base, and they're going to have more of a bluer back with what would be considered kind of a yellow chartreuse line that cuts through them. So it really focuses in like three primary colors for white bass fishing, which is white or silver, chartreuse, and then kind of a combination of a blue, yellow, orange. And that's when you're using like dual colored baits. That might be a crankbait or something like that. But those are really your three color scheme. So you can keep it pretty basic. There are bodies of water in the state, especially in the muddier water, Lake Thunderbird, a Lake Texoma, depending on how much flow is going. If you really get some red water that's coming down, utilizing a red pattern, either a red grub or real popular baits or red lipless crankbaits. So we'll go through all of that. It's not to say that you're not going to catch white bass on bright pink lures or bright red lures or bright orange lures or anything like that. When they start to feed, it really comes down to more of the size profile than anything else. And as they really get active, like I said earlier, white bass mouths, even on the bigger fish, still are only about that big. They don't have the ability to open that mouth up like a largemouth bass. Even bigger crappie are able to get a mouth on them that's more like this. You can't get white bass where their mouths are going to get to where you can stick an adult human hand inside of their mouth. So that really kind of limits what your bait is going to look like, your size profile. And because these fish hunker down on the bottom of the river, that is where the difficulty comes in with white bass fishing. It's offering these small lure profiles at depth and then fighting with current and things like that. So we're going to show some tips on how you can, accomplish that without really elaborate setups, because white bass fishing, for all intents and purposes, is easy. It is a very straightforward cast and retrieve, not a lot of fancy technique or jigging or anything like that, where you're needing to pop and pause and use different types of equipment. It is take out whatever rod and reel that you got, throw on a lure, cast it out there, retrieve it in at most retrieve speeds, and you're going to find fish. So that's why they're a very fun fish. They're a great family fish, especially when the run's going on. You can get out there on the bank with, your friends and family, and you can fill up buckets or baskets or stringers full of fish and have great fish fries And that's kind of what the gist of the white bass run is for us in Oklahoma each year. So with that, I'm going to get into our baits. I'm going to start with our hard baits first. I'm going to start on the end of things that you might utilize, but are going to be less effective. There's going to be more problems with them than you are baits, but they will catch fish depending on where you're at. And the first one I'm going to start with are going to be our spoons and slabs and blades. So these are very basic baits. So this is a blade bait, and it is just a shaved piece of metal. There is nothing to it. Its weight is all built in to the amount of metal that is on that bait. And so this bait right here is going to be a 1/2 ounce bait, but the bait profile is really good. So when we're looking for bait profiles for white bass, we really want to keep it about the size of your index finger, give or take, somewhere in that 1 to 3 inch range. So blade baits do make a great profile. These are good in prairie streams, especially when you don't have a lot of hang-ups on the bottom. If you can run baits like this through open water, these are great at this time of year, just like a lipless crankbait, to run these low into the water column, and it's a good bait profile. So this is going to be one of your more effective hard baits, especially in big tailwaters when you have some rushing current that is not stipulated by just what the water flow coming downstream is. That tailwater is going to be based off of however many gates are open, how much water they're releasing. And so heavier baits in big tailwaters like a Caw, Keystone, the 3 dams on the Neosho River system, which are going to be in Disney for Grand Lake, and then Hudson Dam and Fort Gibson Dam, the tailwaters of those, you're going to get some deeper water. You're going to have heavy currents that are getting lots of activity down there from back eddies and everything like that. And that's where blade baits are going to be most effective. When you get into smaller prairie creeks and streams, this is not necessary. This is going to be overkill, and you're going to find a lot of hangups when you're running a bait of this size, especially with the double treble hooks. When you're fishing in smaller water, if you can utilize a single hook point, you're going to be much better off, because inevitably with any type of river fishing, you're going to get hung up. That's just part of the game. That's why jig heads and soft plastics are usually the number one bait choice or lure choice of like white bass anglers, crappie anglers, where you're trying to utilize really small bait profiles, but you're having to utilize them in areas that I just have heavy, dense, either cover, bottom structure, things like that, and treble hooks like this, especially baits that have double trebles on them. You're just going to run into a lot of problems. But in the bigger tailwaters where you have that current and you're less likely to get all the way down to the bottom, something like this is going to work really well in that current, because it's weighted up here in the front. So it's got a little bit thicker up on the front, and then the back is very slim and slender. So when you're casting this just a little bit up current and bringing it basically back to you perpendicular with the water flow, you're going to get a lot of good action out of this on this little half swivel, where it's going to be rotating back and forth and have a real nice tight wobble and good flash. So that's where you're really looking to use your spoons and then your blades. And like I said about shad, it's pretty basic as far as your colors go. This is just a very straightforward gizzard shad replicator, silver body, black back, quintessential shad circle mark. Then you can get into something that's a little flashier, something that's got some more silver through it, a little bit of that chartreuse, or you can use something that gets straight into the chartreuse. But these are going to be your main color choices. So in the bigger water, 1/2 ounce, 1/4 ounce blade baits, cast masters or spoons, things like this, these are pretty big. When you're running a cast master that's about the size of your finger, in these big tailwaters that we have in Oklahoma, especially on the Arkansas system and lower down on the Grand River system or Neosho River system, utilizing a bigger spoon like this or a cast master slab that's going to run in that 1/2 ounce, 3/4 ounce, but the bait profile itself is going to be about the size of your finger. We have a lot of other temperate bass that are mixed in. You're going to have your striped bass and your hybrid striped bass. So something like this is a good choice when you're in those bigger tailwaters, because it's going to give you the opportunity to hook into a much larger fish or the the higher end of where those white bass, those 3, maybe 4 pound white bass, those are going to give you a real good play at that. When you get into the smaller creeks, when you're in shallower water, less flow, you could use a Castmaster, but you're going to be looking at using like a 1/16 ounce, something that you might use for trout fishing. Then you might also see slabs that look like this. And these are going to come in different sizes from a 1/4 ounce all the way up to 1 ounce. Again, you can cast these out and you can straight retrieve them in that current. They're going to wobble. You can also kind of jig them and let them flip up, and then they will erratically flutter back down. Most hits come back. But typically when you're using spoons or big slabs, even blades, you're using them in deep water flats in the lake during the post-spawn summer, fall months, and you're trying to get those fish in that deeper water presenting vertically off of a boat, or sometimes you can get to them off of like a big long pier or dock. But those are going to be your real key big tailwater lures, your Castmasters, big spoons and slabs, blades, when you're in those huge basins below 10-gate dams where you have hundreds of yards of river across. You might be in water that could be up to 20, 30 feet deep. So fish are going to be spread out. That's the time to use stuff like that. And typically you can run those baits through the water column with less problems than you might find with like a build crankbait in that heavy current. So definitely utilizing those in the big tailwaters. Some other hard baits are going to be our lipless crankbaits and our diving crankbaits. So the ones with the bills or the lips on them. And this is really just going to come down to where you're fishing and when you're fishing. So as I said earlier, there are lots of white bass currently that have pushed upstream. I fish on the Cimarron near my house outside of Chandler, and that is 30, 40 river miles north of or west of Keystone. So you're going to get a mixture of resident fish, white bass that live full time in the river systems. They never retreat back to the lakes. And you're also going to get all of those fish that are going to be pushing up from the lake and fishing 30, 40 river miles away from the mouth of where, that lake is at this time of year. To have as many fish as in there tells me that across east of I-35, there's plenty of fish that have staged pretty far up these rivers already, with the little bit of flow that we've had, but mainly because those water temperatures are up. So in those cases, when those fish are hunkered down on the bottom, when that bite really kicks off, that first real good rain flow, we're going to see this weekend where we're at, where I expect to see much higher catch rates, especially east of I-35. It's not going to be the peak run, but I expect to see these fish to get a little bit more active. And they get more active when they get that pulse of water. It indicates to them that it's either time to move farther up to where their staging areas are, or it's indicating for them it is time to think about spawning. And so they just get more active. And that's when using the crankbaits is awesome. That is when you get just a phenomenal crankbait bite. Most of these size profiles on these crankbaits are what would be really considered too large for these fish to be able to inhale, but they get into this active feeding mode. And in the water, when you're moving these baits through and they can't get that good of a look at it because you're fishing in dingier water, they will really hammer crankbaits. They won't be able to inhale them. So when you're fishing with these double treble hooks, and it can be difficult to remove the hooks. If you get a largemouth bass that inhales a full double treble, hard bait, you're in there trying to remove all those points from inside the mouth. With white bass having those small mouths on them, they'll take a swing at that crankbait, but because of the tension from your rod tip and the current, when they hit it, they're grabbing anything, and those hooks just catch their face. So what you end up with is typically you'll get 1 point of the hook actually in their mouth, and then the rest of the bait sucks up against the side of their face, and you get multiple hook point penetration. So your landing success is very high as far as retrieving, getting those fish in. And that typically occurs at peak run. When those fish are actively looking to spawn, you really get that big crankbait bite. And we're not quite there yet. I haven't experienced it where I've been fishing. I've been catching them on soft plastics down on the bottom of the water. It's been a little taxing, but there's fish there to catch. And it keeps you going because this time of year you can get into a bigger fish. You might find one of those big fish that's sucked in that is waiting. But when we get in, here's a box of half-ounce rattle traps, lipless crankbaits. There's a few different models. Your generic brands like a Bass Pro, they're gonna call them some type of crankbait. But Bill Lewis original rat L trap, you're gonna see that in most stores. And then there's a few other brands that are gonna carry baits. And essentially, what a lipless crankbait is, or a rattle trap, is shaped similar to those bladed baits. They're going to come in kind of a football shape. They're not overly wide. They're hollow, and they're typically filled with rattle, either little metal balls or little pieces of plastic, something that as they wobble in the water as they're moving, they create a knocking sound, and that is just extra enticement for those fish. But basic, I'm always partial to something like this, just the chrome black back, very basic, perfect gizzard shad imitator. But some flashier colors when you're getting, maybe if you're farther on the southern part of the state, you have a lot of thread fin. Then something more like this that's going to do a better job with that thread fin, that bluer back, kind of that chartreuse that comes through the middle, and then you still have that silver through. And then just different shades of silvers, blues, chartreuses. And that's pretty much what makes up this box right here. But these are half-ounce. So you're really looking to use these if you have super heavy flow. If you're fishing in, water that's less than 10 feet in depth, and you've picked up that water flow that's going to come through, that's when using that heavier bait profile to get it farther down into the water column. Otherwise, 1/4 ounce, 1/8 ounce lipless crankbaits, you want to be down bottom third of the water column without hitting the bottom if you can avoid it, because that's when one of those treble hooks might find something as simple as just a little twig that could be sticking up that got stuck in the sand on the bottom, and you end up pulling onto that. And sometimes you can't break free, and your hard baits are always going to be your most expensive lures, especially today with rising prices and all that. You're looking at, for a lot of these, especially name brand crankbaits, you're looking anywhere between $7 and $10 a pop. That's why utilizing jig heads, soft plastics, it's all, you're going to get the best bang for your buck. And that's typically going to be good all the way out throughout the course of the season. But it is a really fun bite on these hard baits because they nail them real hard. So you get a real big hook bend. Your hook success rate, because of all those points, you're almost always landing the fish once they've been hooked up, barring some type of fluke, hit a tree, snap the line, something like that. They can almost never throw the hook once they've hit it. We have some smaller baits in here, all the way down to kind of that 1/8 ounce size. So these are going to be the 1/4 ounce size profile. So I'll pull out the a 1/4 ounce versus the 1/2 ounce versus the 1/8 ounce. I really like the 1/8 ounce models when I can use them. I'm a big advocate of the smaller bait profile that you can throw in any type of fishing. The more success you're going to have with just catching fish, because those smaller fish are usually more abundant. And so you're going to catch them first. And those bigger fish are, when they're actively feeding, they're going to take a smaller bait. So you're not at all stopping yourself from catching big fish by using small baits, but you will stop yourself from catching large numbers of fish, or maybe even getting into fish to begin with, by utilizing the right lure. But you're looking at too big of a bait profile, and those fish just are ignoring that bait size because it doesn't make sense for them to chase it. So that's usually the biggest issue that I see with anglers when they might have a lack of confidence that, what am I doing wrong? And you might not be doing anything wrong. You might be in the right place at the right time, throwing the right type of lure. It's just your size profile is too big. So anytime that I go fishing, especially somewhere I've never been before, I'm always going to start off on like the smallest size that I feel comfortable throwing based on water depth, current, wind, things like that, for casting. So here is this is the 1/8 ounce profile. So these are all going to be the Bill Lewis rattle trap. This is the tiny trap. So this is an 1/8 ounce. It's going to be about knuckle to tip of the finger in profile. Here's the 1/4 ounce of the same exact color. So we're looking at almost double the size, both in length and in girth. And then we have the 1/2 ounce, which again, we're just kind of slightly staging up of each of these. But if you're going to go for any type of lipless crankbait and you're not familiar with lipless crankbaits, you don't own any, you're going to buy them for the first time, starting off with just the silver black back and getting maybe one of each size and utilizing that's going to put you on fish the fastest. These are great multi-species lures. So as the crappie begin to kick up, largemouth bass, depending on where you're fishing, these are great multi-species baits for both big rivers and reservoirs. So that's where I always start with the lipless crankbaits, is just the basic silver blackback models. You tend to get the most value out of those. As we move from the lipless crankbaits into our build baits are arguably the largest selection of lures that you're going to find at a given bait and tackle shop: Bass Pro, Cabela's, Academy, Walmart, local mom and pop store, online retailers. Build baits are just very abundant. For one reason, they're very effective. They are great at stimulating predator fish's lateral line systems. They tend to get a lot of bites, not only for keying in on matching what they're feeding on, but they also get reactionary bites. So they're just a very good all-around lure. And with the bills, they allow us to get to certain depths without having to do it manually. So build baits are designed by the shape and size of the bill, as well as the angle at which that bill is shaped. And then depending on your retrieve speed, which these are pretty much set up in a depth range for a steady retrieve. You can obviously get them to go a little bit deeper if you crank just a little bit harder, and you can get them to go a little bit shallower in that depth range if you're slowly retrieving them. But those bills that are on them, they can be square, they can be cylindrical shaped, and then depending on the angle, and then also the size profile. So for white bass, you're really looking at those medium-sized crankbaits. So most crankbaits, if you go to a big store and the build ones, they're going to come in their size selections, and they're going to be listed as like, depending on the brand, it could be like in 01 and 02 and 03, and whatever the first number is could be a 301, 302, 303, just depending on the brand. Usually that medium size one, whatever's in the middle, those are great temperate bass, white bass ones. And again, you're just looking for shad profiles. So something that's in, silver or white that maybe has some chartreuse mixed in. I really like a chartreuse crankbait with a black back on it. I fish a lot more stained water, being in the central part of the state. So something like this that has got that real chartreuse body, little bit of that red underbelly, and then that dark back. So when it's in that stained water, it's going to do a good job of looking like those shad going through. But with that chartreuse, it's just going to get a little extra, look at. And then if you're in really stained water where the shad population itself can be affected by that light not penetrating, like on a Lake Thunderbird, then looking for something that is more of like that milky washed. What happens to fish when they're not getting enough sunlight in that real murky water? They'll start to become kind of like that ghost. But silvers, white, chartreuses, If you stick to that to start, that's really, you don't need to really key in much more than that. If you get into the clearer water on the eastern half of the state, maybe like the Illinois River system, upriver of maybe like the Spring River that comes into Grand Lake, where you have more cobble bottom, lot clear water, then you may need to tinker around a little bit with those color profiles where those fish might be keying in on, a particular blue and yellow or blue and orange, something like that. But in most cases across the state, white, silver, chartreuse. If you're having to get beyond that, it's probably because you're fishing where there's not fish. These are schooling fish. If you're not getting bit using these types of baits, making casts where you know that your bait is running through the deep hole or running through that run in the bottom third, using any of these baits, and you're not getting bit, it's probably time to change locations or just the day that you happen to be fishing. Maybe the water temps are too cold. Maybe the water levels aren't high enough. Anything, can come into play with that. But you stick with just those basic things, you're going to be just fine. For some of the more like colorful baits, the hard baits, Bomber, they make a Model A crankbait and then some offsets of that, which tend to be pretty good for white bass, especially over on the eastern half of the state, and running colors that are a little bit more brightly colored. We're like right under the light here, so kind of skews what they are. But here's one that's got that green back and that chartreuse through the middle, and then that nice orange underbelly, and then one that's got more of a blue on the top with that yellow and that orange underbelly. They'll also key in on these if you're not using just that chartreuse or silver or white. Something like these are very good dual colored or tricolored lures that you can look to use. And most of the build baits, if you're using something like the Bombers, they're going to have more of that kind of cylindrical shaped. They're going to dive a little bit deeper. In most river systems, you're looking for a bait that's diving somewhere in the 6 to 10 foot range. If you're in real shallow creeks or a creek mouth, or maybe the flow isn't quite there, it just depends on what the substrate is. If it's nice sandy bottom, like on the Cimarron River, for example, or the Arkansas, if you're fishing areas that are straight sand bottom and you don't have hangups, you can bang those crankbaits all the way along the bottom, putting those treble hooks down in that. You're not going to get hung up, and you can get bit pretty easily with that. But in most situations, you're going to be fishing these crankbaits. You're looking for just a medium diving crankbait. But there are scenarios where maybe like a square bill bait that's only diving down like 1 to 5 feet, that can be effective too, just depending on the amount of fish, what type of creek you're fishing in, that water depth. That's all going to kind of come into play. The main takeaway from this course is just really what you're looking for, like the time of year. So the water temps, the outside temps, rainfall, and then just what they're really keying on, which most of the time is going to be a 1 to 2 inch bait profile. Once you get that down, then where you fish locally, or if you look at our white bass guide, you go somewhere else in the state to try something new. The little nuances that come into fishing, like whether you're using a square bill or maybe a little bit deeper diving bill, those are what you're going to learn when you're on the water. And there's not really a good general answer for that, because every location changes. You can be fishing the same body of water, same river system, and hit 2 different tributary creeks, and the composition of both of those tributary creeks is entirely different, and it may affect how you're presenting to the fish, even though we're ultimately trying to accomplish the same thing. 1 to 2 inch bait profiles, bottom third of the water column, putting it in front of those fish where they're stacked up. That's essentially what we're getting at. And then the smaller end of the build baits. So here's like what are often labeled as like panfish or crappie type crankbaits, these real small ones. These can be good if you get into real shallow water. And again, you want that hard crankbait bite. But at that point, you're probably still looking at, switching over to a soft plastic where you're less likely to get snagged, because even these small ones will still have one singular treble hook off the back of it, and it's a bottom almost all hard baits. The hook is going to be on the underside of the swimming motion of that bait. Whereas when you're fishing soft plastic baits, more often than not, it's a single point hook, and that hook is on the top side of the bait, which allows you to hit the bottom of the bait on stuff without getting snagged up. So, but that is that's kind of it for the hard baits. As far as like top water goes, so here's our deeper divers. So if I was in a big river system, this is something that I can really get down on the bottom from the bank. Something with that big long bill on it. But again, that size profile of still same size body, just a much bigger lip for deeper diving action. That black back, chartreuse body. That's typically what I'm going to start out with if I'm using a crankbait just about anywhere I go, unless I just know I've been somewhere where there's a very particular color or model that has outperformed other. But usually during the peak of the run for most people, the difference between 220 fish and 195 fish isn't that much. So, if it takes that with a color, you're kind of arguing semantics at that point and isn't really that important. The other hard baits that we have are our jerk baits or our topwater baits. But at this time of year, topwater really doesn't come into play. That's going to be more post spawn. You're going to see that back in the main bodies of water as those fish get back into the lakes. They're going to go to the wind driven sides of the body of water as we get into May. So when on bodies of water that have really good shad populations, so like Lake Texoma, for example, those shad are going to spawn in May. So all of the temperate bass, the hybrids, the white bass, the striped bass, they've all completed their spawning cycle. They've come back into the lake and they're back in the lake by May. And then middle of May, early May, those shad start spawning. And they really will push them up into shallow water, right up on the riprap, coves, any wind-driven points, that side of, it's usually going to be the northeastern end of Lake Texoma where those southwest and west and south winds are driving bait balls. And that's where the topwater action will start to pick up. And with topwater, pretty basic. Poppers, little walk the dog lures, and propeller baits. So things that like Zara spooks, the Hedon spooks, something like this that you can just kind of walk across the water, or just basic little pencil poppers. Or here's a pencil popper, here's kind of a fatter popper, these, and then baits that like Hedon torpedoes that have the little propeller on the back of them, something like that. But what white bass anglers like to do is take a leader line and attach. You can do it a couple different ways. However you like to tie a line on, you can tie a little like loop and put a lasso around the back end of the treble. You can tie an actual knot and cinch it up to it, but give yourself about a 12-inch leader line off that rear treble and tying on something really small, real small soft plastic on like a 1/32 ounce jig head, or a real small hair jig or marabou jig, something like this, in like a 1/32 ounce. And you basically, fly fishing world, it's known as a dry dropper or hopper dropper. And you work your topwater bait, and this jig, every time you move this, it's just kind of hopping subsurface a foot. And you'll get fish that'll come up and take the surface bait, or you can double up and get one takes the subsurface bait and you get hooked up on the top. But topwater for white bass and temperate bass species typically kicks off in about May, and it'll run all the way through the summer, mornings and evenings, into the early to mid fall. And then at that point, during the middle of the day, you're targeting fish out on deep water flats and trying to jig them up off the bottom or utilizing a live bait. So topwater doesn't really come into play at this time of year. Jerk baits might, but jerk baits are really expensive. And other than the fact that you can just suspend them, the suspending or the slow rising or slow sinking ones, unlike a build bait or the lipless crankbaits that, depending on the size of it, the water current, and how fast you're retrieving, is how far it's going to stay. With a jerk bait, you can usually get these things right in the middle of the water column. And depending on whether they're a slow riser, slow faller, or a suspender, The only thing that I like about jerk baits, if I was to use one during white bass, is the size profile. They're nice and slender. Um, but the hook points are pretty far offset. So you really need fish that are hitting from back and behind with white bass because of the size of their mouths. You really want short and compact baits, 3 inches and smaller. That's why the medium size build baits, the 1/4 ounce and 1/8 ounce lipless uh, crankbaits, those are all going to be just that perfect size range for white bass to not only actively go after, but more often than not, they are a size profile that most of the fish can actually inhale that bait, which is just going to lead to better hookup success. White bass, when they're in the shad and things like that, there's a lot of chaos that's happening in the water. So you're going to be running your bait over a lot of fish. So determining, especially if you're using a single point hook. If you're using treble hooks, you're going to snag fish. You could snag white bass. You're definitely going to snag shad when they're in there. But noticing the difference between actually getting bit versus the, tap of running over the backs of fish. When you're using any of the hard baits with those trebles, it usually doesn't matter. You either get swiped and hit and you're hooked up, or you've snagged the fish and you're hooked up. There's not a lot of determining whether or not you need to set the hook or not. So that is why I really like when the crankbait bite picks up, because it's just super simple fishing. You're just casting out, retrieving, and when they hit it, they hit it. This time of year right now, when it's a little bit more of a grind, there are fish to be caught. You can catch a lot of numbers of fish, but you're really having to work for it. You're separating the difference between banging bottom, getting bit, short strikes, hitting other fish that are in the water. For me lately, it's just been big schools of shad that are top of the water column all the way down to the bottom of the water column. So you're constantly moving downstream trying to get to the back end of these schools of shad so you can get out of them, because when you're in the thick of the shad, the odds of getting bit on your artificial lure versus all of this natural forage goes way down. So you really want to be targeting the back ends of these bait balls, or when you're in still water like a lake, then you're trying to get right on the bottom side of the bait ball, but above the school of the actual predator fish, and determining what the depth of that is. So I'm going to look over at the questions here real quick before we get into the kind of the meat and potatoes of this course, which is going to be the soft plastics, what you're going to be using right now. The hard baits are easy. They come right out of the package, tie them right on. You can use a swivel, you cannot use a swivel, however you like to tie on your bait. I prefer to be tied directly to the bait. I want to be in constant contact, so I don't use swivels a whole lot. But either way, they're just cast out, straight retrieve. You're not really working them, so there's not really a lot to go over as far as tips and tricks, other than just the depth at which you're trying to hit. I always start off on the shallowest diving and the lightest baits I can use, and I will size up from there as opposed to trying to size back down. And then I'll just find the sweet spot from there. But there's not a whole lot of complexity when it comes to just your crankbaits. They are exactly what they say: cast them out and crank them in. What's the best pound test line to use? So with white bass, depending on where you're fishing, so there, and this is kind of a twofold depending on where you're fishing. Where you're fishing, so what's in the water? If you're fishing an area like the Arkansas River, below Keystone, below Caw Dam, you are going to have big stripers mixed in. You're going to have big hybrid striped bass mixed in. In those cases, when you're using most of these presentations and fishing in that bigger tailwater, you're more than likely using at least an 1/8 ounce, all the way up to a 1/2 ounce, maybe even a shade bigger, 3/4 ounce. So in that case, no matter what you're using, whether you're using spin casting equipment, spinning equipment, casting equipment, somewhere in the 10 to 14 pound range monofilament is going to be perfect. That's going to be able to hold on to those bigger stripers or hybrids that you may get into, and it's plenty to catch the white bass without affecting your casting. The other kind of twofold part of it about where you're fishing is going to be depth and water current. So if you're fishing in an area where it's almost exclusively white bass, you don't have to worry about tagging a fish that is going to snap my line, but you're faced with significant current maybe, or just kind of the bulk of fish, maybe the the size range of where you have to reel in through to get your bait back. 6 pound test, I think, for white bass is the low end. You start getting into 4 pound test with current, you're just going to snap off a lot of equipment for no reason. If you want to fish for white bass out on the lake post spawn through the summer into the fall, you can certainly size down to 4 pound line class, 6 pound line class, but 6 is about as low as I would get. And that's only if I'm fishing like a creek, or I'm fishing in an area where I'm in water less than 10 feet deep. I know it's unlikely that I'm going to hit anything over 5 pounds. And I'm using a medium light to medium action rod. So if I'm using that medium light action rod, 6 pound test, and I hit a 4+ pound fish, that's going to give me everything I can handle. That's going to give that equipment everything, especially with current. So that's kind of where I determine what size of rod and then line class that I'm going to use, is more based off of that current first. Now, if you add in the tailwater aspect of much bigger fish, then it's not even a question. You're starting off with at least a medium action rod and 10+ pound test, maybe even a little bit bigger, maybe a medium heavy action rod with like 14 to 17 pound test, because you're still going to be able to cast those 1/8 ounce, 1/4 ounce jigs and crankbaits, but you have got plenty of equipment should you hook into something much bigger. So that's kind of what you're looking for line classes, somewhere between 6 and 14 pounds, but you really kind of have to tailor it just depending on where you're fishing and what's available to catch where you're fishing at. Do we know if the sand bass population has declined in recent years? We've had an influx of people moving into the state and many are outdoor enthusiasts. So white bass are prolific reproducers. The only thing that is going to affect, and they're short-lived fish as well. So they're kind of like dove. They reproduce in just astronomical numbers. They're not very smart. They're not very long-lived. So they make up, their defense mechanism is big schools, lots of offspring, up those biological odds for survival to pass the genetics down to the next generation. So with that, we're going to see influxes of white bass levels across the state every year based on one thing: rain. If we don't have the rain during the spawning window with the light cycle and water temperatures, you'll just have a bad recruit year. Because they're short-lived fish, you will sometimes see during, a 2 or 3 year drought period, you have very low recruitment. You will see the average size of fish go down. You'll see the total number of fish go down on the given body of water. It can rebound in 1 year. They grow, white bass are going to grow up to 6-10 inches in that first year and a half, 2 years of their life. So they're going to grow from the time that they're born to eater size, catch and keep size within, a year to 18 months, depending on their forage. So quick growing species, short-lived fish, massive reproduction. As long as we have reservoirs in the state, you will just see numbers, they'll peak some. You'll have a decade where it's just, man, you can't walk across the river without, all these fish. And then other times it's like more sporadic spawning schools, wasn't as good in primetime spots. And that's almost always indicative of, we had low water years the previous, 2 or 3 years, but they'll rebound super fast. Up in like the Grand River system, like with paddlefish are not massive reproducers unless they have water, and they are a longer lived, longer growing fish. And so you can see big declines and big increases over a decade. With white bass, you'll see it in a year. You'll see it in 2 years. So if you're fishing an area where it seems like it's gone down, it's more than likely lack of rain. It will rebound, sometimes better than it was what you thought was the best, a few years later, just based on rainfall. So that's one fish species we really don't have to worry about as far as more angling pressure, more fish being taken, anything like that. They're always there. They are so prolific that all we need is rain, and that's it. That'll just bump them right back up. What is the difference in benefits between using a crankbait and a rattle trap? So they're both crankbaits. One's a lipless crankbait. The others are going to be diving or build crankbaits. Really, the only difference is just kind of depth control. So I like diving crankbaits when I'm in the river because of current. I know that I'm going to get it to a certain depth. If I'm fishing in still water and bank fishing, I'm more apt to use the rattle trap, the lipless crankbait, because then my depth is controlled by me. Whatever size I chose to throw, so the weight class, whether it's a half ounce, quarter ounce, eighth ounce, how far, like how deep of water I'm fishing in. So how long I allow that bait to sink before I begin my retrieve speed, and then how fast my retrieve speed is. All of that's going to determine where I stay in the water column. And when you're fishing from the bank, not on rivers, because rivers, a lot of times you're fishing on the bank side of the deepest water. In a lake, you're almost always fishing from the bank in the shallowest water. So the water gets deeper the farther it goes away from you. Whereas when you're fishing on a creek or river, it could be the exact opposite. You could be standing right on top of what's the deepest water, casting to the shallow water, bringing your lure as it gets closer to you into deeper water. So when you're fishing from the bank, using diving crankbaits is a pretty dangerous proposition unless you're really familiar with the area, because you're essentially fishing uphill. So when you cast out and you're standing here and your bait's going out here and it's diving, so here's the grade, here's the deeper water. You're diving, diving, diving. You're in the strike zone. You're in the strike zone. Now you're starting to come back to you, but that bill is still diving. You'll drive it right into the once you hit the bank. So it could be 15 feet away from you, 20 feet away from you, and you have now struck bottom going back uphill. So not only are you banging that thing along the bottom, where if it's only hitting rocks and sand, it's fine. But the second that it finds anything that's laid down, whether it be a log, a stick, grass, weeds, anything, you're losing that lure or you're getting a real bad hang up. So with the lipless crankbait, when you're fishing on the bank in a reservoir, you're fishing uphill. So I can control that. I know that I can really slow roll it for the first, several cranks, knowing I'm out in that deeper water. And then as I get closer to the bank, I can pick up my retrieve speed and that bait will rise back up in the water column and it'll avoid getting snagged. But that's really the only two differences is of those two baits. Obviously the size profile is a little bit different on width, but for all intents and purposes, build baits are just great for boat fishing or for river fishing, and lipless crankbaits are great for fishing on still water, shallow water when you're fishing from the bank. When fishing below a dam when water isn't being released, would you use a blade? So, I mean, ideally, if I'm fishing below a dam and water is not being released, I'm probably not fishing. You could get these big stilling basins, and if you're not generating water through there, those fish have a tendency to go find the deepest part of that channel. They will suck right down on the bottom, and it is very difficult to get bites. You can put live bait, artificial lures, and hit those fish in the nose. And because they're no longer getting that pulse, it stresses them out. They feel water levels drop. They will get accustomed to a certain area. So, like the big stripers that are up on Keystone and Caw below the dams, they understand that the water level will drop and drop and drop. And in some cases, below Caw, those fish have died. They've stopped too much water. You get sandbars, the water disappears. Those fish try to retreat downstream to follow the flow to deeper holes. They end up stranded. That happens periodically below Caw, not as often right below Keystone. It's a little bit bigger basin for a farther stretch downriver, but fish are very they're swim bladders, so pressure, air pressure that you get. So big storm systems come through. You typically hear, hey, pre-front conditions. You go out and fish right before a big storm blows through because it usually means falling pressure. And so their swim bladder is kind of their regulator. It allows them that comfort level. Like we as people, if you go and eat Thanksgiving dinner and you overstuff yourself, you end up on the couch asleep for a few hours. That fish, their swim bladder does the same thing with rising and falling water pressure, as well as the outside air pressure that they get as well. So typically in those big tailwaters or in rivers or in lakes, as that water is falling down, especially migratory and spawning upriver fish, they do not like that. It will shut them off. It will stress them out. They will be looking for survival more so than for food. So in cases when water is not being released below dams, your best fishing bet is to utilize live bait. Either throw a throw net in the water, get yourself some shad, go to the local, most dams have a local bait store either right there on the dam or very nearby. They probably sell minnows. That's the time to use live bait. It's very difficult to catch fish on artificial lures at any time of year when water's not being generated, especially during daylight hours. You might see some activity in the overnight hours, and that's just a byproduct of the bait fish pushing in shallow towards those rocky shorelines, warmer water temperatures overnight, and some predators may follow them over. But at this time of year, if they're not generating water and you're fishing right below a tailwater, live bait is going to be your best option in those scenarios. Okay. So that gets us through the question. So let's move into the soft plastic baits. And this is really going to be key right now. In most bodies of water, especially if you're fishing in the rivers and the creeks and you have staging white bass, they're going to be looking for those shoal areas. So areas where that riffle section, where that water is really shallow, that's what they look to spawn over. So in some cases, the fish that are staging in the pools right below them, that they're looking, they're staying right there until they're ready to push up onto those shoals or those riffles, and then they'll broadcast spawn and they'll be done. Other times, that is a natural barrier to their next progression upstream. So anywhere where there's current. Now, what I've found where I fish locally recently is that the abundance of shad that is in the water, especially in the mouths of these incoming smaller tributary creeks off of the Cimarron, they're depleting oxygen levels. So there's so many shad getting into these basically mouths. So the Cimarron's current is coming through. It meets the mouth. It creates a little bit of high oxygen right where the two areas meet. But right up the creek mouth from there, you're in essentially still water, because without major rainfall, all of the water that's coming down these smaller creeks that feed the big river systems, when they run into the main river, they stop. They hit, and they try to release some water out, and it typically will create a nice little current curve. So downstream of the mouths of incoming tributaries are the places to look for white bass right now. There's going to be more oxygen flow. It's going to be a little bit faster current, and they're going to look for little current breaks, whether it be the seam line where the riffle section dumps into the runner pool. That's going to create a current break right up against that wall or shelf or whatever it may be. You're going to have a lot of fish that will hunker up against that. Then you're going to have fish all the way across to the bank with that current, and they're going to look for any type of like micro current seam, so little eddies, if there's any laydowns, log jams, anything like that. Those fish are going to hold tight on the bottom and look for those little current breaks, because while they're enjoying getting all that fresh oxygen and that flowing water, they're also, because the water temperatures are just getting to the point where those fish are feeling comfortable to actively be engaged in feeding and spawning activities, they're not trying to use that many calories. They're trying to reserve their calories as much as they can. So they're going to look for those soft spots right out of the current. And that's where you're really looking to target, like right now, for the next couple of weeks until they really get into the peak of their activity. And then the hard baits, the crankbaits, bigger swim baits, things like that are really going to come into play. But right now, the game around most of the state is going to be small hair jigs and small soft plastic baits. And then how you get to depth. So like I said, white bass, they're going to be bottom third of the water column. They're going to be hunkered right down on the bottom. Even the ones that are willing to give chase or feed, they're still going to be in that bottom third of the water column. And sometimes with current, we're trying to throw these real small bait profiles, these 1 inch, 1.5 inch, 2 inch bait profiles. And a lot of times you're having to pair them with like a 1/4 ounce jig head, which is, this huge jig head on this little tiny bait. But it's so important to get that bait as close to the bottom as possible right now, especially when these fish are in these staging areas. They're just not willing to come up off the bottom, and they probably have enough natural forage around them that doesn't make a lot of sense for them to go chasing your fake lure through the water and expend all these calories. You got to try to get it right on them, put it in an area where it's an easy strike for them, and that's going to be right in the bottom third up against these current breaks. So your big soft plastics, well, we'll do the hair jigs first because I don't have very many boxes of the hair jigs. Where did I put that other box there? Oh, right here, right in front of me. All right, so hair jigs, the cheapest ones, like the ones that most white bass anglers are going to use because you can get them anywhere, you can get them at Walmart, local bait store, are going to be just the basic Johnson brand beetle bows. It's just a little marabou jig. They're going to come in like a 1/8 or a 1/16 ounce. You might even be able to find them in a 1/32 ounce. They're like a 10 pack for like $2. Very effective. They accomplish everything you want out of a bait, which is just small, shad-like, and they're going to look something like this. They're going to come in yellow packaging. It's a yellow back. It'll say Johnson. Their Johnson is, most well known for their beetle spins. Most people who started throwing artificial lures as a kid, your parents, grandparents, aunt, uncle, whoever you went fishing with, probably bought you a little tiny, beetle spin that you threw out there, and that's Johnson. And they make these little marabou jigs that are like this. And you're just looking for something in the 1/8 to 1/32 ounce range. It really just depends on water depth. And right now, where I've been fishing, 1/8 ounce has been fine. There's a little bit of water coming down the river. I'll see this weekend. We did pick up some rain, but kind of where I fish is right on that boundary where we went from a 1/2 inch of rain all the way to I-35, where it was almost no measurable rainfall. So I've been able to get away with using an 1/8 ounce jig head, which is perfect. It pairs a little bit better with the soft plastics, but your hair jigs are going to be tied all together. So the jig head and the bait or the lure is all one piece. So you don't have to worry about pairing anything. You just take these right out of the box. Whites, chartreuses, and that's when these get in the water, all of this pulses when it's in the water, and it looks very lifelike. When you have these things on dry land and you look at them, they kind of look like, what would ever bite that? It doesn't, there's nothing to it. But you put these things in the water and they really just have that nice pulsing action that you see from bait fish when they're just casually swimming through the water. Their pectoral fins and then their tail fin just creates this real subtle, soft pulse. And that's what hair jigs do such a good job of. You can use what are called crappie magnets. These are just little hair jigs that are real small. These are great in smaller bodies of water, creeks, real small size profile, and they'll come in like a black or a white or a chartreuse, but something like that. And that's pretty much it for your hair jigs. You can spend more money on nicer hair jigs. Typically winter bass fishing, December, January, February, you can catch some big largemouth bass, big smallmouth bass out in deeper water utilizing hair jigs. You get a lot of big shad die-offs in the winter, and these big lazy fish will sit down in these deeper water for their wintering grounds, and you can utilize a much bigger, and these are not bass size jigs, but they're certainly big enough to be too big for like crappie. VMC is one of the brands that makes a lot of pretty good hair jigs that you're going to find at box retailers that you'd find at an Academy or Walmart or a Bass Pro. But these are a little bit bigger. These are going to be 1/8 ounce hair jigs. Decent size profile. It's about the right size. So something like this, but they will make these all the way up to like an ounce. And a lot of bass anglers will use them during the winter, and you dead stick them and vertically jig them with using your electronics in deep water. But usually just the basic white with the little red flash through it, or maybe like a chartreuse and orange. But all these colors are going to be fairly similar. So that pushes us into the soft baits. And most soft baits are going to be something that you buy in a package, and then you end up pairing it with a jig head. So you're doing half of the work, you're putting it together. They do sell soft plastic baits that are pre-molded, which can be great. Storm, the brand Storm, they make a wild eye shad, and their smallest size, their little 1/8 ounce or 16th ounce ones. They make these are great. They come in usually a 3 or a 5 pack. They come in good colors. You can get your solid silver with iridescent flash, very basic shad, and then your flashier shad with the chartreuse and the white through it. Only knock that I have on these, and I love these little guys. I don't use them a lot when I'm white bass fishing or out in the rivers. I like them in like ponds and smaller lakes. The only knock I have on them is that they're internally weighted, so they're all put together. So that weight, you have this hook, and that hook you can't really see it too well on the webcam with the lighting, but that hook shank stays right up here at the top and runs all the way to the eye guide. But down here on the bottom is this metal weight that they have on there that sits at the bottom. And just for whatever reason, the way these things are shaped, when they get hit by those fish, what ends up happening, and sometimes you can get a dozen fish on one of these before it happens. Other times I've bought them and it'll happen on the first fish. But you'll end up pulling the eye hole and the weight through the body of the bait. And once you do that, it's done. You can't fix it. So because they are a little bit more expensive and pre-weighed or pre-molded, and so you only get like 3 to 5 out of a package, whereas if you're using soft plastics that you're pairing with a jig head that will come in packs from 15 all the way up to 50 or 100, you're not really worried about it. You're expecting those baits to get chewed up and you swap them out. So it's just kind of your preference, but they're a great bait profile, 1/8 ounce, real good. Like you can throw those out. They can be real solid. It's just, I have a lot of problems with that weight cutting out from underneath them. So I go through too many of them to make it worth my while. Especially with white bass, when you start catching them in the hundreds, you want to utilize baits that you're going to get the most value out of for the longest period of time. Because when the run's going on, you're usually having 2 rods rigged up, or you run a double jig set. A lot of people will do that. They'll run 2 or 3 jigs hooked up onto the same main line, and you'll be hooking up all 3 hooks on the way back in. So just something to think about. All right, so let's get into our soft plastics that we pair with jig heads. And for our jig heads, you have a few different basic options. The most common basic option is just going to be your straight round ball jig head. 1/4 ounce, 1/8 ounce, 1/16 ounce are going to be the most commonly used. It's going to be based on water flow, current, and depth. You want to be in the bottom third. So sometimes you need a little bit heavier jig head like this, which is going to be a 1/4 ounce. And then as far as colors go, usually it's not that big of an issue. I like to kind of match the color of the jig head with the soft plastic that I'm using somewhere close. So, a white kind of goes with everything, but I'm going to pair white with white, or white with white soft plastics. You can use any of the heads, but you're going to use like a bright chartreuse one or a bright orange one. You might want to look to pair it with a jig head that has a similar color scheme on it, as opposed to something completely opposite. And as technology's evolved and jig heads are easy to make. I mean, it's just lead and, mold. So a lot of homemade jigs are made in jig heads. I like kind of the swimming heads when I'm using the soft plastic. So instead of having that ball, it's more of a narrow kind of minnow shaped head like this. But you'll see lots of different jig heads. All you're looking for is something with the jig head where you have a straight shank hook that comes off of the head, comes back and curves with a hook profile from the tip of the head to the back of the bait. That's only, an inch or 2. They do make like specialty jig heads where you'll have some similar shaped head, either this minnow type head or a ball shaped head, but the hook shank is meant for like bigger bass lures or larger profiles. You're just looking for the very basic model, and that's typically what you'll find, especially if you're going to just a big regular brand store like a Walmart and Academy. Bass Pro and Cabela's might have a few additional options with those specialty jig heads, but typically if you go into a mom and pop bait store, or any one of like a Walmart, Academy, Atwoods, anywhere where they sell fishing products, you're going to see stuff that are just going to be those basic ball or minnow heads, and they're going to be the right size. So with the soft plastics, that's really, the biggest growth in the fishing industry over the last decade. Is there is now soft plastics for everything. They keep changing. And really what you're looking for with soft plastics, when it comes to these white bass, again, 1 to 2 inch bait profiles in something of a white silver chartreuse to start with. And then you can start kind of going into the oranges and the pinks or the blacks or more naturally colored blues and greens, things like that. But every soft plastic seems to be a little bit different, right? So what we're really looking for is a swimming bait. So something that's got a paddle tail on the end of it, something with a bumper. Flukes are going to have more of the split tail. You might catch some fish on that. But what they're doing with these is you're trying to stimulate the fish's lateral line. So the more elements that you can add to a singular soft plastic, the better, the more action that you can get out of it. So a lot of them you'll see where this is kind of like a combination of what was once a grub and a swim bait, and you just kind of take the two and combine them together, and you end up with stuff that looks like this, where you have what used to be just that grub body, and it would have a curly tail on the end of it, and now they've made them where you have the little bumper or paddle tail on the end. So these are really good size profiles. You know, you're going to have that chartreuse tail, something. This is going to be packaged anytime that you have kind of that clear white with the black flake through. It's usually labeled as like monkey milk. And then just your whites and chartreuses, basic whites, sometimes like a pale faded pink color like that. It's not really hot pink. It's just kind of that real faded pink. Again, we have very bright lights right above us. So on the webcam, all these look a little bit lighter than what they actually are. But just a box of soft plastics that they all the same type of bait in there, just some different colors. And these are going to work. Any of these soft plastics, you're going to get great multi-purpose out of them because they're going to work great for crappie as well. In some cases, some of your better white bass soft plastics are actually labeled as, you know, they're crappie. They're labeled and advertised for crappie fishing, but they work really well for white bass. And then curly tail grub. So these are essentially the same thing we just looked at, except instead of having the bumper tails on them, we have curly tails on them. But I'm a huge advocate of these smaller bait profiles. So these are all what you would find in the crappie section. When you look at like the bass grubs that they're going to sell, you're going to start to get into that little bigger range of like 3 to 4 inch grubs. And the size profiles change pretty dramatically in girth of the bait and the tail, even if the overall length of the bait isn't substantially different. So the difference between something like this and something like this, I'm always going to start with this. And if I can catch them on this all day long and I'm catching a steady stream of fish and occasionally I'll catch a big one, but I'm mostly averaging like 6 to 10 inch fish, then I will size up and maybe try the bigger size to see if I can entice some of those bigger fish. But starting off small and getting bit and getting the confidence in that there are fish there, that you're doing the right thing, that, you know, the good fishing is going to continue. It is so much easier to size up than it is to maybe get some strikes on something that's bigger. And then you size down and then you're not catching fish. And maybe it was because with that bigger bait, maybe you're hitting fish in the side easier. So it felt like a bite, but it wasn't a bite. Maybe you were getting some strikes that would come. But when you size down, it really wasn't the right color that they were looking for. So anytime that you can get them on the smallest size possible with the color and the jig head or the ounce that you're throwing to get it to the proper depth, it is just so much easier to be like, okay, I'm going to size up. I'm going to try to catch bigger fish. I'm going to get out of the way of these 6 to 10 inch fish. I'm going to start looking for fish that are, 14 plus inches, and then throwing the bigger baits that the smaller ones can't, get a hold of as easily, and then sizing up. But this is kind of these are a lot of the colors that we'll use for like walleye and saweye, but these chartreuses and these oranges are going to get bit pretty consistently. It's just good white bass colors. And again, you're just going to find grubs in different sections of different stores. But typically, if you're starting off in the sections that are marketed and advertised as crappie equipment, those soft plastic baits are really where you should start. You're just going to find the right type, right size profile, um, and they're pretty easy to pair with stuff. Those bigger jigs, those bigger grubs, you might just not get as much use out of them later on. You always get use out of these smaller baits. So when you buy them, you go to your local pond, local creek, you go summer fishing. You're just going to get so much more value out of those smaller bait profiles long after you've gone white bass fishing. Those bigger ones, you may only pull them out of the box once or twice a year. And then sassy shad. So sassy shad are kind of the number one artificial soft plastic used lure for white bass in the state. And all a sassy shad is actually a trademark name for Mr. Twister, which is a brand. So Mr. Twister makes this short, stubby paddle tail swim bait, and they call it a sassy shad. There's lots of replicators out there from all of the major brands. I believe these are the Bass Pro model, and I got these because they're the sassy shad. They come in like a 2 1/4 inch and a 3 inch. These ones were just a little bit smaller, but again, you're looking for just those basic colors of the shad, black backs, blue backs, silver, and you would just pair these with the jig head as well. So all these soft plastics you're going to pair with the same type of jig head. Which is the nice thing about soft plastic fishing for things like crappie and white bass, is you tie on the jig head and that's it. Then from there, you can change out what you're doing all day long without actually physically having to cut off and retie a bait like you do when you use the hard baits. And that's why people will use snap swivels so that they can snap it off and put on another one, which is also an option. I don't use snap swivels. So for me, it's kind of like I'll use the soft plastics first. It's easier for me to change them out of jig heads, as opposed to I'll have a couple of rods rigged up with kind of my go-to hard baits. And if I'm not getting bit on those, I don't spend a whole lot of time going through different hard baits to use to see if I can key them in. I've got a better chance of doing that quicker and easier and more effective with the soft plastics. The one that's been my little killer lately on the Cimarron where I've been fishing has been this little guy right here. I don't even remember what these were packaged as. I think that this is just a Bass Pro basic swim bait. But the ribbed swim baits, you'll see them. They'll come in like hard plastic. Different brands make different sizes, but this was a real small one that I found. Now the color itself, I don't know what they had it packaged as, but you'll see it as like bluegrass a lot. Again, with the lighting, it's kind of hard to tell, but it's got what I would consider like a pale or gray blue back, and then kind of a chartreuse underbelly with some like green. It looks like a greenish blue kind of sparkle that they have mixed into it. But these have been what I've been able to catch white bass that are harder to catch. Wading through them, of anything that I've thrown, 95% of the white bass that I've caught on the Cimarron where I fished this year have come on that bait with an 1/8 ounce jig head. I actually got the rod that I have one rigged up on right here, just that little 1/8 ounce minnow head, and then those baits. And I've been going through those left and right, and it does a really good job in the water of mimicking those shad. So anytime that you see things that are labeled as like bluegrass, when these actually get in the water, that iridescent flash that those shad will give off, when this is in the water, it is so like when it's out of the water, it looks real bright and vibrant, but when it's in the water, it takes on a very subtle pale color, and it does a really, really good job of like what a small shad or minnow that these white bass are looking for. So I kind of I've gotten everything that I've wanted out of this bait this early in the season. It's really been the top producer for me just because it's doing such a good job of mimicking that natural forage. Now, I will still get bit occasionally. I've caught bigger fish on some of the sassy shad type baits, especially that black and chartreuse. Still does a good job. It's a little bit bigger bait profile. I've caught some bigger fish on it, but I've also caught the biggest fish that I've caught on this guy right here. So that's been the winner so far. And that will happen at this time of year. We're right on the precipice of the floodgates opening up and the fishing just really getting lights out for white bass, hitting all these different types of lures. But when you're fishing earlier in the year like this and you're looking for staging fish, it is a more taxing type of fishing. You do have to find that size, color, where they're at, and how they want it. Whereas we get a few weeks from now, it's kind of just cast it out and they're going to hit anything. And that's when it gets real fun. Should we retrieve the curly tail with a jigging motion or a straight retrieve? What about the paddle tail grub? So all of these, you can fish them however you want. But the great thing about white bass fishing is it is just a straight retrieve. So curly tails, tubes, paddle tails, any soft plastic bait that has a tail that is meant to be fished, the only one that, doesn't have that you can catch fish on is going to be what are labeled as baby shad. So baby shad are going to not have a bumper or a curly tail. They have these small pulsing tails on them. And these were created for crappie because you can fish them. You dead stick them, basically. You fish this with a bobber. You can cast and retrieve them and catch fish. But these are great because it's an artificial lure that works like live bait. So when you cast it out below a bobber and this is sitting still in the water column, just the wind and the little bit of current in the water will pulse this tail without you doing anything, just like a minnow if it was sitting there swimming. So, but you can cast these on a jig head and retrieve them and you're going to catch fish. But anything else that you would potentially use as far as a soft plastic goes is going to have some type of tail, whether it be a curly tail or a paddle tail that's meant to be retrieved through the water. The jigging aspect of it is really more for creating like that dying action, the fluttering of a fish that's been hit or wounded and it's fluttering back down and the bite comes during the flutter. But for white bass, when they're moving up, straight retrieve is really all you need. If you're having to do more than that to catch fish, it probably just isn't the best time to be fishing. That's the nice thing about white bass is that you get usually a 1 to 3 week window on a given body of water where fishing is just lights out. Anybody can go out there and just catch fish. And then like right now, it's more about identifying good staging areas. Where are the most amount of fish? Because not all fish are willing to bite right now. Water temps are still a little chilly. We don't quite have the pulse coming down the river. We're not quite there. So you're looking for areas that are going to be able to hold and stage the most amount of fish, because that's going to give you the best odds of when you are casting the artificial lures out there of getting strikes. The fewer fish, the less likely chances because the odds are working against you. But that light switch quickly turns and then the odds go in your favor. There's more fish in there than there's bait. There's more fish looking to be active than there are lures in the water, and then completely switches. Some other baits. I mean, these are all, like I said, soft plastics have just come so far that there's every color, every size, some have just little subtle differences. The big craze right now with swim baits or any type of soft plastic is really the ribbing. So they're making them now where you see this soft plastic, but the ribs on them. And what that's doing is as it swims through the water, because these artificials don't have fins on them, they're not creating any type of that pulse in the water that a fish actually would be doing. You're only getting that off the back of the tail. And so what it does is with these ribs on these artificials, as they come through the water, it's creating a very subtle sonic signature in the water that fins would give off as they're swimming. So you'll notice more and more of these soft plastic paddle tail baits that are typically, they're now more so being packaged as trailer baits, like for umbrella rigs, Alabama rigs, one single fixed line point with several arms coming off for different baits on them. That's what they'd be advertised for. So you don't usually find them in soft plastic packages. They usually come in the hard plastic. There's 5 or 7 of them in there. Um, but that's a little big. These are actually pretty good size profiles right here. And these are kind of like that one that I showed earlier that I said I was doing pretty well on. But there's just so many. I mean, we can go through all these boxes and there's dozens and dozens of different colors. But if there was just a couple that you could ever pick out, the blue with chartreuse in them are always going to be a dynamite dual color. Anything with a black back or a blue back that either has white, silver, or chartreuse is that secondary color on the bottom of the soft plastic. That's really what you're looking for. But it can be as simple as the 99-cent white curly tail grubs or little Johnson beetle bow, those little cheap marabou jigs. That when the heart of the run goes, that's usually all it takes. And that's why the white bass run is so popular in Oklahoma, is you really don't need a lot of expensive equipment or tackle boxes full of different types of lures. Just finding a couple of small soft plastic or hair jigs and just waiting for those fish to get in there, which in this most cases around the state is 2 weeks from now. The southeast part of the state, I think, is going to see the bulk of their white bass run with water temperatures and the little bit of rain that they've got. I would expect to see the peak of their white bass run be, you might start to see some of what would be considered the start of the peak starting this weekend, today, tomorrow, Sunday, Monday into Tuesday before that next cold front comes through. Then the weather looks right now, the extended forecast, it's pretty nasty for about 5 days. That should really temper the fish. Not so much because it's going to really alter the water temps that much. We might even get some rain that will push them up farther. But typically what happens when we get really nasty weather like that is there's not many people out fishing. So those fish kind of get a nice 5-day break from seeing a ton of hooks come through the water at them, especially in really popular public access areas. So I would expect the week coming out of that whatever that warm up of temperature and any rainfall that comes, the storms that we may get 2 weeks from now, the southeastern part of the state, that is more than likely going to be that real big peak part of the run. And once it starts down in the southeast, then we know that it's kind of like week increments as we move 20, 30 miles north up across the state. And then usually by the middle of April is when we start to see the white bass run kind of get north of I-40 and west of I-35. And that's kind of what finishes off the white bass run up in Canton, Foss, Fort Supply. We'll see the white bass run there. Usually peak is second week of April through the second week of May, just depending on rainfall, especially on Canton, Fort Supply, Foss. These are really small incoming tributaries. So they really don't hold much water during the year. So fish aren't able to run up those rivers like they can in the Arkansas or the Canadians or the Cimarron, Mountain Fork, Illinois River. Those fish, there's enough water in those rivers year round that they're able to move up into staging areas. Whereas the Western lakes, especially the Northwestern lakes, but even the lakes down towards the Red River west of I-35, very, very small tributaries. So you need water temps there. And typically when you get to April, the first rainfall you get, measurable rainfall that rises that creek up, whatever that tributary, if you can pump it up to where there's consistent flow for 10, 15 miles, all those fish are gone at once. And so typically the white bass run in the Northwest and the western part of the state is much more consolidated. You get a week, maybe 2 weeks. Canton, it lasts a little bit longer because there's a bigger basin up where the Canadian runs in, and they have a little bit of staging areas to go through. But most of those other bodies of water, your peak window is 1 week. But those lakes also have much better white bass fishing in the summer and the fall months because they're big fluctuating lakes. So these fish get forage year round because they're on shad. So as the water levels rise and fall in these sandy shoals, places like Altus Lugert and Latonka and Canton and Fort Supply and Foss, all those lakes that are like that have those big kind of bowl basins, very sandy. You have really good white bass fishing all the way through the summer, which can't be said on a lot of the eastern lakes for bank anglers. For the white bass, once you get east of I-35, when they get back in post-spawn summer months, it really is more advantageous to be out on a boat and you're fishing them off of big, deep ledges or deep water flats and just trying to get congregating schools, either using live bait, dead sticking over, or vertically jigging spoons and slabs and blades. But so what they lack out west in the actual run itself for longevity and duration, they make up for it with good fishing opportunities, both top water and near shore fishing with artificial lures, all the way through May, June, July, August, September, October. But the east of I-35 is where we get the very prolific white bass runs up the river that can last 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks of solid fishing. And within that solid fishing, there's usually a 1 to 2 week window that is just absolutely lights out. I mean, it's hard to explain because the fishing is so good. Like when you're catching 100 fish an hour, that only happens for a short window. You can't go do that year round without lots of equipment, electronics, things like that to be able to follow fish. This is hit the bank, find those runs of fish going through, and just cast after cast after cast after cast. With that, we got about 10 minutes left. We can go a little longer. We started a little late, and there might be questions. So now's the time to answer questions or ask questions, answer those. White bass exists statewide, so it's really hard to sit here and spend too much time talking about any one area unless you have a question about it. So if you have a question about a specific body of water, river, creek, public access, now is the time to ask it. Otherwise, I probably would have skipped over it. At the top of the chat bar is our white bass angler guide. You got that in an email earlier this week. If you're a licensed angler, you received that email. I also put it in the chat bar and it's on the main page of our website. That's going to highlight a few area bodies of water in each region of the state that our biologists have deemed as better than the rest in those regions as far as public access, and the white bass run. So check those out if they're in your area or you're looking to go do a camping fishing trip early this spring, late winter, you want to get out. That's a good resource to use. Otherwise, now's a good chance to ask those questions, and we'll address that. And the biggest takeaway that I can leave you with from this is that 1 to 2 inch bait profiles, bottom third of the water column, measurable rainfall, water temperatures around 55 degrees, which if you don't have the ability to physically go to the water and put a water thermometer in to take that, look at our fishing report. Sometimes you can get those from whatever the river that flows into that lake. You can get the water temperatures. You can also type in the name of that river and type CFS at the end of it, and you can get stream gauges along our major river systems. And most of the big rivers are going to give you CFS, which can be helpful if you're very familiar with the river, because when you get really familiar with bodies of water, especially rivers and the white bass run, you can just watch the CFS gauge because you know what the number is. Once you know what the water flow that it takes to move the fish, and that is directly related to a specific number on that CFS gauge. So for some areas in a small creek, it might be 800 CFS. On a big river system, it might be 12,000 CFS, but you know what you're looking for. So when you see it rising, you're like, okay, it's time to go. But those are some resources that you can use. You can always go to wildlifedepartment.com or look in the regulations, call the county game warden of where the body of water is. They're going to have the most up-to-date information. If you don't use our fishing report for your fishing information, because you're getting that information a week late. So if it says fishing is excellent for white bass, it was when it was submitted a week before it was actually sent out. So anytime you want that up-to-date information, call the county game warden. They're there, they're on the ground, they're checking anglers, they're in those public access locations. They're going to know whether fish are in the rivers, in the creeks, how much water has been moving through, what water temperatures are. They're going to be able to answer those questions for you. So utilize them as your field guide resource at this time of year. So let's see. Any good locations around the OKC area that you would recommend? So for lakes, Arcadia can be hit or miss with white bass. It certainly has all the ingredients in it to produce a pretty solid fishery. It's got a really good shad population, two small inflows, Spring Creek, which is not a big spawning creek. I mean, it's basically drainage for Edmond. It's blocked off behind Integris right there off of I-35. So pretty much from their big low water riprap structure that they put in there for flood control or whatever they put it in there for, your fish are going to be right in that section. So the majority of the fish are going to be down off the Memorial Bridge that goes across the lake. There's public access right below that bridge. You can put a small boat in right there or a kayak and go up the Deep Fork, which will go right under the Turner Turnpike. And there's some deep holes in there that you can catch fish. But for a lake, if you were to pick one right in the metro, Thunderbird's going to be the best fishery. Those fish are going to go up the Little River. So the Alameda bridges, there's the Sentinel parks that are there. For bank access, fishing the riprap on those bridges here in the next few weeks, you're going to get staging fish. If you have the ability to get a boat on the water, if there is any incoming flow up the Little River, you can just follow those fish upstream. There is, I don't know if it's public right of way, private land that people don't care about, but a lot of people go right off of the Franklin Bridge. That's probably 3 river miles north of the lake on the Little River. Other than that, the Cimarron is the place to look. There's some right-of-way county-owned access on the Cimarron just north of Guthrie, right when you pass Skeleton Creek. That Skeleton Creek's going to be a big feeder band for those white bass. And there's a big riprap wall right where you park right there on 77. And there's a guardrail and riprap. And as that water channel turns through that, right when it gets by it, it goes up and flushes out, and then it goes up Skeleton Creek. So that's a good staging area. As you push downstream towards Keystone, there is some public access right there in Ripley off of the river or lake road. That's where I fish a lot. Downstream from that, there's some right-of-way county access in Oilton, Drumright. Those are going to be, if you want a true like fishing central Oklahoma for a white bass run where you can actually find fish with some decent bank access, the Cimarron River is probably going to be your best bet. The Canadian rivers, Deep Fork River, just finding those county owned access ways where you can park on the side of the road or under a bridge. They're just few and far between. You can look on Google Map. I always go on Google Map. I look for bridges first. And then I look at the bridges and I see if there's anything around where you can see noticeable, like vehicles are going down onto the river or they're parking right here. And then you can just drive and go check it out and see, if there's any posted signs or, signs that people have been fishing. And then you can always call the local county sheriff or call one of our game wardens, call the closest city, call their police department, just ask if it's a county right of way, if you can publicly access that. But the Cimarron in central Oklahoma is going to be your primary actual like run of fish. They come out of Keystone. It's a very good temperate bass run. The fish that come up the Canadian, there's a lot more barriers along the way. You can get white bass right down in downtown on the Canadian right there where they call it the Oklahoma River. A lot of times there'll be fish right below the May Street Bridge or the May Street Bridge in the first low water. So where the Canadian comes in at May, right there is what becomes the Oklahoma River, and where they do all of the crew and kayaking and all that downstream to the Eastern Bridge, and then it becomes the Canadian again. Lots of fish get stuck in there when they're running water. When we get big, heavy flows that come down from Canton, you can catch a lot of white bass right there below that May Dam. But that's about it. I mean, you can work the riprap of the Oklahoma River. It's all public access. But as far as hitting individual holes and things like that, you really need flowing water, heavy to moderate rainfall, good amount of flow coming up over that gate, and you want to be right up against that dam. And sometimes you can get into the temperate bass pretty good, but it's very spotty. It's not very consistent. Or would you recommend going further out? Yeah, I mean, for the white bass, like getting into eastern Oklahoma, either direction, north, east, or south, east of I-35, check out our white bass guide. any one of those lakes that's listed over there on the east, if you're willing to make a trip to go white bass fishing, you're going to find better public access for one. So if you're bank fishing, public access on the eastern half of the state is 1,000 times better than it is in the central part of the state and the western part of the state. There's just more of it, and there's more rivers that are over there that come together for these tributaries for these white bass runs. Horseshoe Bend at 10 Killer, that is a very popular spot and that's usually later. That's usually a early to middle to late April run. You might find some fish staging in there, but to catch them right there from the bank, because that's quite a bit of water that comes around Horseshoe Bend, especially when there's water coming down it. That's a good one. But yeah, check out that angler guide. But right here in central Oklahoma, there are a few opportunities to go get into, a lot of fish. And then you're not that far from going north or south either, whether you're going to Texoma. Texoma's little, maybe 2 hours away from OKC. Caw up there on the Arkansas, you're only an hour and a half, hour and 45 away from that. And those are two very quality temperate bass fishing areas that are in the central part of the state. They're just north central and south central, but those are good ones to go to that have a lot of good public access. What about those top public places to fish from the bank? So your best bank fishing, depending on what body of water you're at, so for Grand Lake, if we're going to take a big white bass run in the northeastern part of the state, there is bank access at Connors Bridge on the Neosho. That's going to get a large push of white bass that are going to come through every year. And then there's a couple of bank access spots off the Highway 10 bridge on the Spring River. And the Spring River, you can't fish for paddle fish, so it sees less boat traffic. At this time of year, people are going up the spring to catch white bass, and there's a pretty prolific run of fish that go up that. And the Highway 10 bridge right there is a good funnel point when they're pushing up. As you push downstream on the Grand system, low water at Shodo Bend, or just upstream of Shodo Bend, at the low water, just below Hudson Dam, that's a really good one. You're going to get fish piled in there for a long period of time, all the way, from right now all the way through May. So there's a very long period because they have a physical barrier and they tend to stack up right there at that low water. They kind of get stuck before they get over that next hump to go up to the base of the dam. So that's a really good one. Below Fort Gibson, you're always going to get fish in that Grand River system, especially the tailwaters. So your top public access on rivers in the States is going to be the tailwaters, just because every dam, for the most part, has either a recreation area or at least bank access to one side. So looking at tailwaters starting in about 2-3 weeks from now, really April is the time to hit tailwaters all the way 1st of April through like the 2nd week of May. All the tailwaters in the state, they're all going to have great public access. When it comes to hitting like the creeks and rivers, that gets fewer and far between. It's not a lot of good public information out there on it. We list what we know. I try to fish as much as I can in and around where I live in central Oklahoma to try to provide that. So I'll find new spots here or there. I've been fishing a lot right now up in Ripley on the Cimarron. That's not too far from my house, and it's a good little staging spot. Stillwater Creek comes in. They busted out the bridge that went across the river road right there, so they have a little low water dam in. I'm not getting any flow coming down of Stillwater Creek, and it's a pretty good sized creek that gets a good white bass run up it. So there's not really any bass staging in the mouth right now. They're just downstream of the mouth out in that current, and there's just shad top of the water to the bottom of the water, and you're getting tons of shad that are dying from suffocation. They're just taking all that oxygen out of the water, and there's so many of them in there. But those are kind of the public access spots that you look for. If it's not a major tailwater for that river fishing, you really just got to do your homework. Google Map, any of the browsers, Microsoft, Google, any of them, or Apple, whatever your mapping system is that you use on your phone or your computer, finding the major river systems that come out of whatever your local body of water is, and then going, going from there, going up the river, utilizing the map, looking for tributaries that come in, small creeks that feed, and just looking for county roads that go up and along the rivers, usually looking at bridges first. And then you just try to find sections of river in there that look like they have a right of way turnoff that's right there. And then a lot of times you can kind of tell what the river looks like depending on what time of year the satellite image was taken, where those riffle runs go into nice big walls. That's what you're looking for, where those fish will pile up on the current side on that deeper water, and where the little sandy riffles dump in, they're just going to use those current breaks and they'll follow that. And that's really how you find that stuff. Now, as far as like lake access goes for public access, that's really going to pick up in the post spawn. So as we get into later May, into June, early July, you're going to see pretty good white bass fishing action mornings and evenings. And that's kind of what it becomes out on the lakes for bank anglers. Early mornings, later in the evenings, you're going to get topwater action. You're going to get fish that push those bait balls that have moved in shallow from overnight, especially on the wind-blown sides of lakes. Anywhere where there's public access like that, state parks, city parks, boat ramps, anything like that, that's where you're looking for these schools to move through. And that really, comes down to just spending some time on the water, because some coves are better than others. You can go out to Lake Arcadia during the summer and fall and catch hundreds of white bass. Most of them are real small, but you'll see the schools just swim around those points all day chasing shad. And that's kind of how white bass operate on any lake around the state. And that's what your mornings and evenings once we get past the spawn. But right now you catch white bass 24 hours a day. When they're pushing up the rivers, there's no better or worse time to fish. It's really just, getting out there and getting lines wet and just waiting for that deal to pop. I've been trying to keep a catalog up on the Cimarron of fishing it, 4, 5, 6 days a week from basically as we started to get warm that last week of February, and just fishing as much as I can and just documenting it of here in this spot with this run, catching this many fish on this day, what were water temps, what were water flows. And you can do that on your own, and you can find those little spots that are nearby your house, which makes it a lot easier in subsequent years, because then you know exactly what you're looking for on those very particular days. But that's kind of it for the public access. It's like there just really isn't that much of it in Oklahoma, and the majority of it is on the eastern half of the state. But the big ones that come to mind are just the tailwaters, especially on the Grand River system, the Arkansas River system, the Red River, Denison Dam, and then the Mountain Fork gets a pretty good run off the north end of Broken Bow Lake. But there's tons of little ones around there. All those little lakes that we have, white bass are a statewide fish. So any flies that you would recommend? So with fly fishing, it's again, just like the white bass artificial and live bait tackle, pretty basic. Clouser minnows, size 2, size 4, size 6. Woolly buggers, size 2, size 4, size 6. Now even technology's made it into fly fishing a lot more prevalent. You're starting to see these like flies that aren't, some people would argue they're not flies anymore, articulated jig flies that, get that. It's a swim bait action, and anything like that, size 2, size 6, size 4. Some of the bigger ones, they use bass hooks on them, like owner bass hooks with bigger jig heads on them. But again, you're looking for just very basic fleshy type flies that are going to mimic a shad or a minnow. So white, silvers, olive backs, dark backs, or pieces of ripple flash that go through them. And you'd fish them the same way. It's really, with fly fishing, the difficult thing with white bass is getting the cast out there, because in a lot of places you're fishing these creeks and these rivers, you don't have a whole lot of back casting area. So unless you have a really good setup right along the bank where you can roll cast and get it across to then be able to strip that line back through, casting, you almost have to get in the river, which in most cases is trespassing if it's not private property, or if it's not public property on that section of river, which are few and far between in the state, or getting out on some type of boat, float, skiff, whatever you can use to get out and fly fish. But check out that check out the White Bass Guide. You can go to Native Water Outfitters. They're highlighted in the White Bass Guide for fly fishing, and they do white bass fishing trips in the spring, like starting here pretty soon, and that's pretty cool. They're one of the few outfitters that you'll find anywhere that do white bass on the fly, and they've become pretty knowledgeable about it. They do most of their fishing over on the Illinois River as it gets going, and they take people out on their fly fishing boats with their trolling motors, and they'll go upriver and they'll fly fish for them. But it's pretty standard. You're sinking line, trying to again get down in the bottom third of the water column, and just little fleshy white, silver, olive type flies, which are going to be woolly buggers, clouds, or minnows, and whatever specialty articulated jig or beadhead flies that are being tied these days that look and mimic shad or baitfish is what you're looking for. So with that, we're through time. I don't see any more questions. So with that, we'll go ahead and sign off here. Appreciate everybody being here. I always like to say on these, we're not an appropriated state agency, so we don't receive any tax dollars. So, we can't do any of this without you guys. And, the main goal from my position in our agency's stance is trying to provide Oklahomans with, the most up-to-date current fishing and hunting information that we can, because, part of the fun of being out in the outdoors and enjoying these sports is also having success when you go out. And typically in these sports, the difference between success and not catching or killing is usually pretty minimal. Things like hook sizes or just where you're fishing or trying. So these courses are designed to try to provide the most amount of information so that you can ultimately tailor your own fishing experience, because we all learn differently. We all do hobbies differently. And the great thing about fishing and hunting is there's no right way to do it. There's just ways that can be more effective in certain areas. And they're great sports that you really get to build. They're confidence building sports. They're good for the soul. They're good for the mind. They're good for the blood pressure. They get you out there in nature, and you can really make those connections. And that, is just so much more important in today's world, is more urbanization, especially in a state like Oklahoma that's continuing to grow urbanly, and even with our agricultural uses and repurposing land. Yeah, as that land that people grew up on Grandpa's farm and back on the creek, as those areas disappear, we will hit that kind of turning point of coming to a head between the user and those who want to exploit the resource. And so being able to get out there, enjoy it, make your stamp, put your mark on it, will really connect you on that when the time may come for you to have to, fight for that in one way or another. So the more that we can help you learn and point you in the right direction, get you to talk to the right people, whatever we can do, just showing an interest in the sport that, we're here to protect and enhance and grow and evolve, really goes a long ways. This doesn't happen in every other state. So we're very fortunate that 1 in 3 Oklahomans hunt or fish. We're very fortunate that your kids and your neighbors' kids and your grandkids and your nephews and your family friends participate in our outdoor education programs. It's just, they're good, confident building things that we see less and less of in a more technologically reliant world. So the more that kids and people alike can stay involved into hobbies that get them outside, whether it be recreational sports or recreational hunting and fishing or golf or biking or conservation, bird watching, anything to get outside. So anything that we can ever do to help to enhance your outdoor experience, anytime you'd like to learn something new. We are a very diverse state. We are one of the most diverse states ecologically in the entire country, which would surprise anybody who's not from Oklahoma, probably surprises most Oklahomans. So anything that we can do to help you out in your adventures and help you be out there enjoying it, that's what we're here for. So always reach out. You have my information through our email. We've got a bunch of these bank focused Asking Anglers coming up here in the next couple of months. So pretty much for every major species, and then a couple of specialty courses. So if it's of interest to you, not everybody can afford a boat. Not everybody's got time to fish 100 days a year. So these Asking Anglers this year are really designed for bank anglers to get you keyed in on a few particular skill sets that will really maximize, that limited time that you may get to spend outside. So we really want to help maximize it. And that's what this year's Asking Anglers are designed to do. So please reach out if we can ever help out. Other than that, we'll sign off. Best of luck out there. I definitely encourage anybody who lives near some white bass waters to go throw a few casts out there in the next few days, and then we'll probably get a little reprieve. And then after that next cold front, I expect to really see fishing across the state get into that beginning of that peak window. So take care, everybody. Enjoy your weekend. Thanks so much for coming, and always feel free to reach out to me or to the agency if you ever have any fishing questions. We'll do our best to answer it for you, or at least get you pointed in the right direction to the person who can. So with that, we'll sign off and we'll see you next time.